Can you describe the space race in one sentence?
Essentially, it was a scramble between the United States and the Soviet Union to get to the moon first.
Are you aware of the moon landing conspiracy theories, and if so, can you describe them?
Other than NASA just faked the moon landing, then no.
Okay. Do you think a collaborative effort in the development of space technology would have been more or less effective than the space race?
I think it would have been more effective because you would have access to more resources if the Soviet Union and the United States collaborated in trying to get to the moon.
So post-World War II, global dominance and national security were associated with space development of technology. And what do you think global power is associated with nowadays?
I think global power today is associated similarly to technology and resources, as well as a good economy and influence in the world.
Great, thanks, Daniel.
The space race was the competition between the USA and the USSR in the 20th century for dominance in space. It was a critical part of the Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991. Early rocket building was taking place in the Soviet Union and in America. Professor Robert Goddard developed solid propellant rockets beginning in 1914 and liquid propellant rockets beginning in 1921. The space race was rooted in the nuclear missile systems of both the USSR and the United States after World War II. The once allies now got to work separately in the race to become the most dominant and secure nation. The nuclear arms race was heavily informed by intercepted German missiles and people in the aggregate program. The aggregate program spearheaded the development of ballistic missiles for the Nazis from 1933 to 1945. Captured V-2 missiles, products of the Nazi aggregate program, were sent to New Mexico in 1945 to be reconstructed, set off, and studied. After World War II, national security was imperative and became an obsession for the USSR and the USA. It was believed national security and global dominance could be achieved through dominance in space. Artificial satellites, unmanned space probes on the Moon, Venus and Mars, and finally human spaceflight in low Earth orbit and to the Moon are some accomplishments of the space race. On July 29, 1955, Eisenhower announced that the U.S. planned to launch a satellite into space by the end of 1958. On August 2, 1955, the USSR responded just days later to the United States proclamation that they would be launching a satellite. The USSR declared that they too were planning to launch a satellite into space. The Soviets were the first to launch a satellite into space. On October 4, 1957, Sputnik was launched into orbit. The Soviets were also the first to put a human in orbit around the Earth. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin took a single orbit around Earth, lasting 1 hour and 40 minutes on Vostok 1. The space race is most notably characterized by the USA's moon landing. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The Apollo 11 mission constructed by NASA was completed successfully on July 20, 1969. Apollo 11 marked the first human landing on the moon. The astronauts landed in the lunar area known as the Sea of Tranquility. The crew manning Apollo 11 consisted of 3 men selected by NASA in January of 1969. They consisted of Commander Neil Armstrong, Commander Module Pilot Michael Collins, Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong and Aldrin were the only 2 to step foot on the moon. The Apollo 11 spacecraft had 3 distinct portions: the command module, the living quarters for the astronauts, and the only module that made it back to Earth; the service module, which was the support for the command module and supplied utilities and power; and lastly, the lunar module, which allowed Armstrong and Aldrin to break lunar orbit and propelled their lunar descent. It also propelled them back into lunar orbit, allowing their safe transfer back to the command module manned by Collins. One of the first to promote the moon landing conspiracy was Fox TV. 2001 aired a documentary titled Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? This claimed the moon landing was faked to win the space race. There was supposedly evidence in film, such as photos of the rippling American flag on the moon, although there was no wind in space, and no appearance of stars in the lunar sky. The film's major claim was that astronauts couldn't have passed through the Van Allen radiation belts in order to get to the moon. The race essentially ended with the Americans' lunar landing and their effective repetition with Apollo 12. After the Soviets failed to beat the Americans in the race to step foot on the moon, they created the first space station in the Salyut 1 on April 19, 1971. After the space race, funding increased greatly into space research and technological development as a whole. The space race also prompted a long-standing metaphorical association of power with science and technology. There was also a long-standing tension between the United States and the USSR.